Let's read from Genesis 32 here, and we're going to skip around a bit because there are some details in the story that aren't really pertinent to preaching material. So let's start in verse 9, and we'll go from there. Jacob prayed, "O God of my grandfather Abraham, and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, you told me, return to your own land and to your relatives. And you promised me, I will treat you kindly. I am not worthy of all the unfailing love and faithfulness you have shown me, your servant. When I left home and crossed the Jordan River, I owned nothing except a walking stick. Now my household fills 2 large camps. O Lord, please rescue me from the hand of my brother Esau. I am afraid that he is coming to attack me, along with my wives and children. But you promised me, I will surely treat you kindly, and I will multiply your descendants until they become as numerous as the sands along the seashore. Too many to count." Jacob stayed where he was for the night. I'll jump down to verse 22 if you're reading along. During the night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 servant wives, and his 11 sons. He crossed the Jabbok River with them. After taking them to the other side, he sent over all his possessions. This left Jacob all alone in the camp, and a man came and wrestled with him until the dawn began to break. When the man saw that he would not win the match, he touched Jacob's hip and wrenched it out of its socket. Then the man said, "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." "What is your name?" the man asked. He replied, "Jacob." "Your name will no longer be Jacob," the man told him. "From now on, you will be called Israel, because you have fought with God and with men and have won." "Please tell me your name," Jacob said. "Why do you want to know my name?" the man replied. Then he blessed Jacob there. Jacob named the place Peniel, which means face of God. For he said, "I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been spared." The sun was rising as Jacob left Peniel, and he was limping because of the injury to his hip. Even today, the people of Israel don't eat the tendon near the hip socket because of what happened that night when the man strained the tendon of Jacob's hip. I told you it's a silly story. It's one of those stories that we go, really? This is what they choose to remember about their great ancestor? Again, I was talking to Michael about that earlier. This is not one of those, hey, you want to hear a story about Grandpa that's really great? No, this is one of those stories, hey, you want to hear a story about Grandpa that's really weird? This is one of those stories. It's really quite silly. Now, there are a lot of things to talk about with this story, but where my mind focused this week was firstly on the idea of fear. And is it positive or negative? Is fear a positive or a negative thing? Now, fear can be really funny to us. It can be very debilitating, right? It can stop us in our tracks. It can keep us from doing things. And sometimes it's difficult to know about fear, whether it is good or bad. Should we fear God or not? Right? That's a question that comes up in our lives often. Should we fear God? Well, if you look at Ecclesiastes 12, verse 13, it says, "Fear God and obey His commandments, for this is everyone's duty." Well, that's how Ecclesiastes concludes the matter, right? Oh, sure, one could explain fear in kind of a reverential way, that fear is about reverence, and I think that's true. But fear is also about fear, about being afraid of something or someone. So that means fear must be a positive, right? If we're supposed to fear God, the Bible tells us to fear God here. It's a positive, isn't it? Except then we're told in 2 Timothy, chapter 1, verse 7 from Paul, God has not given us a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power, love, and self-discipline. So what are we supposed to do with this? Is Paul saying that the Holy Spirit isn't afraid? Or that we shouldn't be afraid of the Holy Spirit? Or is he saying that the Spirit inside of us isn't a spirit of fear and of timidity, but one of power? It's interesting. There are a lot of different ways that we could take these verses and think about them. The truth is that Scripture can be difficult to understand at times. Fear can be both a positive and a negative thing, is what I would want to say. So let's focus on the negative here for just a moment. Fear can be debilitating. We know that, right? Fear can keep us from moving forward. It can keep us from doing the things that we either feel like we should do or that we know that we should do. And so because of that, fear can keep us from being the person and the people that God is calling and asking for us to be. We've been asked to follow Jesus. Fear can make that difficult sometimes. Fear can stop us from following the person that we've all committed to following. Fear can do that to us. But fear can also be positive. Fear can keep you and others around you safe, right? If you feel like you're in a dangerous moment, that's fear telling you, hey, get out of this dangerous moment. Protect yourself and protect the people around you. I would argue that's a good thing. Fear can keep you focused in the moment so that you take care of the immediate task and need that you have before you. Jacob is afraid in this chapter. Jacob comes to this moment very, very fearful about what might happen. He fears what his brother is going to do to him. We always think back on Abraham with great affection. We think back on Isaac with great affection. We often think back on Jacob with great affection. But the truth is, Abraham's family was straight up crazy. This was a messed up family. He wasn't always the great hero that we envision, right? Standing up on the billboard like Superman, right? That's not Abraham. That's not Isaac. And that's certainly not Jacob at all. Abraham passed on some of his good traits to his children and grandchildren, and he passed on some of his bad habits as well. Jacob is afraid because his relationship with Esau wasn't great 14 years ago, the last time he saw him, and nothing, seemingly at least to Jacob, has changed in the interim to enhance their relationship. They haven't seen each other in 14 years. The last thing Jacob knew, Esau wanted him dead. So fear drives Jacob to gently, I'm sure gently, remind God that God promised all those years ago to get him safely home and to aid him in prospering and to growing into a great people. And so again, this is where we can view fear as both a positive and a negative. Was it appropriate for Jacob to be afraid of Esau in this moment? Yeah. Esau wanted him dead. Again, that's the last thing that Jacob knew, was that Esau wanted him dead. We're told that Esau was interested in killing him before he left to go to his uncle Laban 14 years earlier. And so for all Jacob knows, Esau is still the same person that he was before. So why not be afraid, right? It's appropriate for him to be afraid, isn't it? But truthfully, there wasn't a reason to be afraid. Jacob had continued to allow the fear of what could be to tell him how to live his life. So you notice, Michael brought it up earlier. What did he do with his family as he approached his brother? He split them up. And how did he split them up in his fear? He put his least favorite people up front. Well, who's included in his least favorite people? One of his wives and most of his children. Let's just imagine that for a moment. Splits up his family because he's afraid, and he puts a wife and most of his inheritors out in front of him so that they can be killed first. Yeah, this guy's great. Yeah, love Jacob. Way to go, buddy. But even still, he sends his other wife and his favorite son even ahead of himself. This is not really a guy that we want to follow, right? And all of these decisions that he's making in this moment, leading up to meeting with his brother, they're based in fear, not in love. Maybe it was appropriate for him to be afraid. But Jacob had completely dismissed the possibility that Esau could grow and learn and change as a human being. Jacob refused to even to even think that Esau might be different from who he was 14 years ago. Now, none of us have ever done that with anybody, right? We knew somebody back in college or back in high school. We see them again and we just assume what? They're the same old person, right? Now, some of them are, right? Some of them can be, sure. Or maybe our perception of them is that they still are. Maybe we're caught up like Jacob in imagining that people can't really change and be different, that God can't be at work in people's lives. And so I wonder how God might be calling us this morning to base our own decisions in our lives in love and not in fear. I wonder how our friendships and our families and our other relationships, our work relationships, might be different if we viewed them through love instead of fear. It might be a little bit more beautiful world if we began to do that. Things might change for the better. We might end up seeing more positivity around us if we viewed people with the eyes of love instead of with fear all the time. And I understand that our culture, the news, all kinds of people, politicians, what have you, are telling us to view the people around us with suspicion. You can't trust the person next to you. I understand that. But I think our God is telling us not to look at people that way. And frankly, I would rather listen to God than any politician. I would rather listen to God than any news media outlet. As great as you may think that they are, and as Christian as they may claim to be, if they're saying things like that, I don't think they're reading Scripture. God is asking us to look at people through the eyes of love and not through fear. Because the truth is, even if something were to happen to us, what do we have to fear? Paul says elsewhere, "Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting?" To a Christian, what is death? What is death but the next great awakening for us? It's not the end, but simply a beginning. Fear cannot be how we make decisions in our lives. I want to talk about Jacob a little more, and in particular this struggle that he has and his renaming here. Now, I titled this little section right now, Jacob's Struggle, because although this story is seemingly about Jacob wrestling with someone, it's actually about another struggle as well. Jacob is wrestling with this person now, but really what defines Jacob is his lifelong struggle with God. He left home under threat of potential death by his brother. We've already mentioned that. He traveled a great distance to find his relatives, his uncle Laban. He worked 7 years to marry a girl. He was duped by his uncle into marrying somebody else. He worked another 7 years for the girl that he really wanted to marry. He was duped again by his uncle. In the meantime, he was also cheating his uncle. He fled from his uncle, and now he faces his brother again after amassing great wealth in terms of cattle and flocks and family and servants and on and on and on. So as Jacob is returning home, he has to discover who he is. Is he going to be defined as Isaac's son still? Is that what he's going to be known as? Is he going to be known as Esau's little brother? Many of us probably resonate with that kind of idea. Was anybody in here so-and-so's little sister or so-and-so's little brother? Yeah, I face that all the time. Will the wealth and prestige he's gained be his primary identity marker? The truth is, I'm not really sure that Jacob knows who he is in this moment. And that's why I think this renaming story is so important for him. So that, you see, he's got two struggles here. The more existential struggle he's facing is the one that becomes manifest in this physical struggle that he takes on. And so it brings us once again, like last week, to the question, who is this person that Jacob wrestles? I see a few possibilities here. This literally could be a man, right? In fact, the text says a man, and it uses the word man here. It literally could be a man with whom Jacob wrestles after the fighting is, and then after the fighting is done, Jacob proceeds to kind of theologize the moment and think back, okay, that was a man I was wrestling with, but really God was kind of there. It could be one of those sort of moments. I think a piece of evidence in favor of that possibility is the fact that Jacob was actually winning the wrestling match. It's a bit preposterous to think that if this were actually God wrestling with Jacob, that somehow Jacob's getting the better of God. I don't know. Maybe that's just me. A second option is that this really is God who has come in person for this very moment. And I do think this could be a real possibility. Jacob at least seems to think after the event has happened that that's what happened, that God really did show up in this moment. And this wouldn't be unheard of in Genesis, right? You think back to the Garden of Eden. What did God do with Adam and Eve in the garden? He showed up. He walked and he talked with them. We also looked at the story last week of the visitors to Abraham. There are a lot of people who think that was actually God who showed up and walked and talked and ate with Abraham. And maybe that is true. And so maybe that's happening here in this story as well. A third option, and it's the one that I take, and I talked about it last week as well, I think this is an angel who's shown up. And again, because of the reasoning I used last week, that angels show up as people. Angels show up as people in the Bible. And it's only slightly easier for me to assume or to agree with the fact that Jacob might have won against an angel than against God himself in a wrestling match. I'm not sure how God's going to lose that match. Again, though, whoever it is that wrestled with Jacob, the question is why? Why does the wrestling happen? Why did this moment occur? And I think the truth is, it becomes fairly obvious. Jacob is stubborn. Jacob is a stubborn, cheating, lying little man. So God shows up in whatever way he does here to wrestle him. And you've probably known people in your life who have to learn the hard way. Known people like that in your life? Maybe your children are like that, or your parents were like that, or maybe even some of you are like that. You're one of the I have to learn the hard way kind of people. I think that's Jacob. I think Jacob is a learn the hard way kind of person. He's a liar. He's a cheater. He plays favorites with his own wives and his children. He's inattentive to his wives and his children. And the list goes on and on and on about him. If he doesn't need a good wrestling match to snap him out of himself, then who does? Jacob needs a good beating. Again, we've probably known people like that. His whole life has been about struggling against God. It was about struggling to get people to pay attention to him. It's been a struggle for God to get Jacob to make the choices that he wants him to make. And so Jacob has been stubborn this whole time. It's interesting that Jacob, again in the story, gently reminds God to be faithful to him. Oh God, remember, you got to get me out of this because you promised to get me home safely. If you think back 14 years ago, those of you who know the story of Jacob leaving to go find his uncle, Jacob lays his head down at this one place that becomes the location Bethel. And he has a dream of these angels coming up and down this great ladder. People remember this story, right? But do you remember the quid pro quo, basically, that Jacob has with God in that moment? Jacob says to God, God, you will be my God. I will worship you and honor you if you bring me home safely. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not really in the habit of putting conditions on my relationship with God. It doesn't seem like the best way to have a relationship with God. God, you're great and all, and I want to worship you, but only if you do X, Y, and Z for me. That's what Jacob does. So you can see from very young his struggle with God. And so this is what makes the name change so interesting. Jacob, his whole life has been struggling with God. What better name could he take than one who struggles with God? And it's not just about this moment of wrestling, although that certainly happens here. This is about the bigger life story about who Jacob is. That he can't get out of his own way. That he can't seem to follow God the way that he's supposed to. What's actually interesting about the name Israel is the subject in the name is actually God, not Jacob or Israel. Literally, the name means God struggles or God fights, which is interesting because that's precisely what God has been doing Jacob's whole life. God has been struggling with Jacob. God has been struggling to get Jacob to see where he's wrong, to push him to be different and better. God fights Jacob. What a great lesson to learn from him. And so I thought, what ways might we be struggling against God? What ways might we be adversaries of God? Certainly not like Satan or the demons or something like that, right? We've been going through Screwtape Letters on Wednesday night. I don't think any of us really resemble them. But are there ways in which we are being adversarial toward God? That God is having to struggle and contend and to fight against us, against our will, against our desires? Are there ways in which we need to give ourselves over, to submit to God, who is more powerful, who is more loving, who knows more, and all of these things, and yet we fight against God all the time? How might we need to be changing like Jacob needed to change? So just a couple of things to conclude this morning. The first thing is, has fear been positive or negative in your life? In particular, has fear of God been positive or negative in your life? And I also thought about it from the standpoint of, obviously, back in the 1800s, it was really big in Christian circles to push the whole fear motivation, right? To get people to respond to God. Right? Don't go to hell. You don't want to go to hell. That's the worst place you could possibly go, so you better come to church. Fear can be a motivator, right? But is it the best kind of motivator? What ways can we use fear in our conversations to get people to respond? Is it appropriate to use fear in our conversations with people to get them to respond to God? I think all of these are really important topics to think about. And then how does fear in your life affect you? Is it positive or negative? Are you allowing fear to stop you from being the person that you know you need to be? Are you looking at other people with the lens of fear instead of with love? Don't let fear stop you from building relationships, from looking at your neighbor with love. Then the final thing, I thought about this as an interesting exercise. Jacob, of course, didn't get to choose the name that God gave him. He probably wouldn't have chosen Israel if he had gotten his choice, right? What name, though, if you could choose, what name would you want God to give you? How would you want God to know you and to call you? Because to me, that question really cuts deeper to, if God's going to call you something, then you already ought to be exhibiting those traits, those habits, right? If you want God to call you beloved, to rename you beloved, then you probably already have a loving relationship with God. The name that you want God to call you comes deeply out of who you are. So as we think about our own relationship with God, again, Jacob teaches us a lot about how not to have a relationship with God. Based on the kind of relationship you have, what would you want God to name you? There's a lot to learn from Jacob. There's a lot else in Jacob's life to learn from him. I would encourage you, like Michael and Karen did, go read some other portions of Jacob's story because it's really quite fascinating. I mean, this is a man who actually ends up dying in Egypt, right? At the end of Genesis, his story continues from this moment on all the way to chapter 50, where he dies in Egypt and leaves a legacy of his children, but in Egypt, not in the land of promise. There's so much that happens during Jacob's life to learn from. So I hope maybe this whetted your appetite to go think about Jacob some more and think, I want to learn some more from him, because there certainly is a lot to learn from him, a lot about how not to live, which is good. We need that reminder sometimes. Sometimes we need those people in our lives to say, yeah, I don't want to be like that. That's not the kind of person that I want to be. And that's, to me, the kind of person that Jacob is. So this morning, like Jacob, you may have something that you're struggling with. You may have something that you're in contention with God about. This morning is a great time to let us know what that is so that we can pray with you, so that we can pray for you and encourage and comfort you as you go through it. So we offer this time here in a moment to do that. We also offer it for those who have joys, thanksgivings that they want to bring to thank God for doing something in their lives. All of that is welcome this morning. We're going to have this time right now where we stand and sing. So if you have any of those things that you want to let us know about, do so right now as we stand and sing.